how is this reality created? What's your views on the power of that subjective reality that we experience?
This internal reality is thought of as unimportant, trivial, fantasy, imagination, not really of any substance. In the imaginal realm, you could say that things are mental, but they are also ontologically real.
Hello there, my name's Tim Walter. I'm about looking at a fundamental shift of perception in your life for improved well-being using meditation, mindfulness and dowsing. The grand thing that kind of really caught my attention right from day one when my spiritual path started was, how is this reality created? How is it that we experience this? Now, of course, that's a ridiculously huge question again, like we were talking about earlier on. What are we here for and all of this sort of stuff. But what's your views on the power of that subjective reality that we experience, rather than the traditional scientific objective nature of reality that they explore?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Thank you for that, because we often think that reality has two levels. There's objective reality and subjective reality. And subjective reality is often thought of as immaterial, meaning worthless, actually. So, for example, if we don't understand something, we say it doesn't make sense. As if, the only things that are important are things that matter and things that make sense, which all has to do with what we call the external objective reality. And this internal reality is thought of as unimportant, trivial, fantasy, imagination, not really of any substance. And one way you can think of it, the philosopher Henri Corbin, a French philosopher, a good friend of Carl Jung, incidentally, came up with a third category. He called it the imaginal realm, to be distinguished from the imaginary realm. And in the imaginal realm, you could say that things are mental, but they are also ontologically real, not just fantasy. And so that category would include all sorts of reports of paranormal experiences, for example. And Henri Corbin used it in reference to his own studies. He was a scholar of Islamic Sufism, the mystical tradition. And he studied, for example, a 12th century Sufi mystic named Surah Vardy. And he believed that Surah Vardy was actually instructing him directly, even though Surah Vardy had been executed some, almost 800 years ago. So, and he felt that was an example of the imaginal realm, that he could reach out and communicate with a Sufi master who had died 800 years ago and receive instructions from him. So the imaginal realm pertains to all kinds of examples of people who have contacts with the deceased or with extra-dimensional or extra-terrestrial beings. It gets laughed at. People think, oh, you're hallucinating, or your imagination is getting carried away. But if we allow for this third category, we can look at things a little more differently. Without having to deny the foibles. Human beings are subject to all kinds of foolishness and all kinds of fantasy, but it doesn't mean that every internal experience is just a fantasy.
One of the things that you do really succinctly and really well, and I haven't really seen it put like this before, in your essay, you talk about the fact that there are fundamentally 9 kind of arrows of argument towards the positive aspect of yes, of course, there's survival of human consciousness after death. I hadn't seen this kind of process laid out like that. Could you fill us in on a little bit of that kind of thinking? Because that ties in a little bit with what you're saying there about...
Well, when we look at the best evidence for survival, which was the topic of this essay, my approach was to say you have to take an overview. You have to have a holistic approach. And the best evidence is really a combination of all the evidence, because what we see are 9 different independent lines of investigation, all pointing to postmortem survival. You've got near-death experiences, you've got reincarnation, you've got mediumship, mental and physical mediumship. You have cases of possession. You have cases of individuals who are contacting the deceased using electronic means. The fact there are tens of thousands of hobbyists doing it right now as we speak, and also deathbed visions and after-death communication. So these are all independent kinds of experiences, but they're all pointing toward the same conclusion.
That there indeed is something that survives after we pass away. I think one of the interesting things that kind of has always puzzled me is how how the individual character of the person survives, and yet we believe that it's possible that we get things like reincarnation, which obviously would then be an interpretation, a new aspect of the same character, but yet the character survived. Do you have any view on the way that might kind of any theories that you've kind of really taken a fancy to?
Well, let me start this way. At the University of Virginia, they've been researching cases of reincarnation for 50 years. They have in their database over 2,500 cases. And what they're focusing on are primarily cases of young children who start talking about past lifetimes almost as soon as they can begin to speak. And in some 1,700 of these cases, they are considered solved, which means that the information provided by these young children was enough to enable researchers to actually identify the previous personality. So we can say that we know that we have good reason to believe that at least these 1,700 children actually did reincarnate. And furthermore, there are many cases in the reincarnation literature where the death wounds of the previous person show up as birthmarks in these young children, which is really quite remarkable. In fact, another surprising statistic is that a very high percentage of the young children who remember past lives had previous lifetimes that involved a violent death. So that may be why not everybody remembers these lifetimes, but it doesn't mean that everybody reincarnates or everybody has to reincarnate. We don't know enough about it yet. It seems as if maybe once you're in the afterlife, you have different options, and reincarnation is one option. Other options might be to move into other planes of existence within the afterlife. So I don't know. Sometimes people say there's a conflict between spiritualists who don't believe in reincarnation and past life researchers who do. But there doesn't, to my way of thinking, necessarily have to be a conflict between all of these. It's sort of like the blind man and the elephant. It depends, what evidence you're looking at. But the evidence for reincarnation, if you consider 1,700 solved cases, I would say that's a strong piece of evidence.
Absolutely. The numbers absolutely stack up. You mentioned communication with the deceased through electronic means as one of your 9 arrows of supportive evidence. And I hear that you were quite taken with this. This was quite a surprise for you when you were doing the research for the essay. Tell us about that.
Well, it's true. I think I had an attitude that many, even parapsychologists have, because you see these reports are all over popular TV channels in the United States. All of these ghost hunters with their ghost boxes and their other electronic equipment, and they believe they're talking to the deceased. But very often, all you hear when you listen to these recordings is sounds that are indistinguishable. They're not clear, and it seems as if people could be projecting or imagining that they're having such conversations. But as I looked into it more deeply, I realized that there are some of these recorded conversations are very clear and distinct, and it seems beyond question that people are having two-way conversations with deceased individuals, and it often occurs where there isn't even a microphone at one end. So the deceased individual would have to be picking up telepathically on what the other person is communicating or saying, even if they're speaking out loud, no microphone recording their voice. And yet on the radio or device, electronic device, could be a computer, the conversation is a two-way conversation. Some of the most extensive work in this area is being done by a woman named Anabela Cardoso, who is a former Portuguese diplomat. She was charged affairs in some of the major embassies there. A very sophisticated, intelligent woman who has been publishing a journal and has published research articles in peer-reviewed journals, working in acoustical laboratories, and still getting excellent results. So I think this is something we have to take very seriously.
Again, it's one of those areas. I came across ghost boxes some years ago and thought, nah. And I sort of left them alone, closed the door on those, walked away. But you've kind of piqued my interest again. I'll dig out some info about that lady. That she sounds good. One of the things I want to make clear to viewers, as I say, maybe people that aren't familiar with your work, all of this stuff, you're obviously very open-minded. You're obviously very open in terms of what you are willing to listen to and consider. Do you feel as though you come at it all, though, from a science-based perspective?
I think I started out from a skeptical perspective. When I was an undergraduate in psychology at the University of Wisconsin, I wrote a senior honors thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism. And my intention going into the writing of that thesis was to describe the various forms of psychopathology that caused people to mistakenly believe that they were having experiences of ghosts and apparitions and mystical experiences. I was pretty much just a conventional materialist. I thought this would be an interesting science project to show how these deluded people have these mistaken beliefs. But as I began researching it more carefully, I came across the work of Abraham Maslow, a great psychologist who had written about the most successful people in our culture. He studied people like Albert Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt, and really high achievers. And what he discovered is that almost universally, they reported what he called peak experiences. And these peak experiences were identical to what the literature would describe as a mystical experience. And furthermore, they claimed that these peak experiences were central to their success in life. So I had to change my point of view at that point. After being confronted with this research, I realized you just can't dismiss mystical experiences as being the result of fantasy when they're central to the lives of high-performing people.
Yeah, and at what point then did your dream with Great Uncle Harry occur when you were doing that research?
Well, that research would have been in 1969 as an undergraduate in college. My dream of Uncle Harry was in 1972, so a couple of years later.
Yeah. Okay. 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 So that's interesting from the point of view that you were going through that kind of shift of perception around that period, which is great, isn't it? Because clearly. We need there needs to be a little bit of groundwork sometimes before the door suddenly opens to the experience that we might call mystical, and that's clearly where you were going. Well, it would appear. This concept of heaven and hell, once we depart this existence, have you any thoughts that you want to share on that aspect of our continued existence?
It seems as if certain religions, particularly fundamentalist Christianity, places a very strong emphasis on hell as a way, I think, to motivate people to behave well. And of course, nothing wrong with people behaving well. The definition of God is goodness. That's where the very word for God comes from in the English language. So I'm in favor of people behaving in a good way. But we can see from, let us say, near-death experience and the afterlife memories of young children who report reincarnation, they are 95% positive. People report experiences of overwhelming love as part of their near-death experience. They report beauty. They report colors that you can't even imagine. They report incredible sense of intimacy with other people there, including their deceased loved ones. So it would seem as if from all of these accounts, the afterlife is mostly positive, and people occasionally report hellish experiences. Oftentimes, when you analyze it more carefully, it seems as if these experiences result from people who have a burden of guilt that they share, and they've been conditioned to believe in hell. It's not clear to me from the near-death literature and the literature of other young people remembering their afterlife experiences that we have such a distinction between heaven and hell as you would find in some religious theologies, the fire and brimstone and so on. The afterlife seems much more positive than that overall. I also looked into the great book, Heaven and Hell, by Emanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century Swedish mystic. And Swedenborg also describes hell as not such a bad place after all. It's not necessarily heaven, but at the same time, some people would prefer to be there because it's consistent with their lifestyle on earth. That many people, people in business, for example, are accustomed to looking out for themselves first and maybe cutting corners where they can. And little white lies is something that a person who's involved in sales will do normally in the course of their business career. And this is what they're comfortable with. It's not necessarily evil. It's not the worst thing in the world. Now, I could go on and on about it. Would leave it at this, that all the reports that we get of the afterlife from many different sources suggest that it is largely a very positive experience.
I would have a conversation about heaven and hell and evil or not until the cows come home. Maybe another day, perhaps, when you have some more time. But last question, really, Jeffrey. I guess I try to help people on a very practical level. So this is partly why I present them with the the idea of get some dowsing rods or get a dowsing pendulum and start to really explore that aspect of yourself that you can find by doing that. What would be your take away, or what would you leave for people to take away in terms of if they want to try to develop their subtle energy side, that they might perhaps open up a doorway to a sort of mystical experience?
Well, there are hundreds of things a person could do, everything from automatic writing to tarot card reading, or working with the I Ching, or dowsing, as you have recommended, or remote viewing, or various forms of divination. The simplest thing, and the one that I tend to recommend the most, is meditation. Just learning how to sit quietly with yourself. It doesn't require necessarily any elaborate instructions. There are 5 or 6 main styles of meditation. You can work with a mantra, or you can just sort of let your mind relax. It's not so different really from daydreaming for some people. But the idea is to be quiet, to relax, and to turn inward. And I think one should approach it without any great expectations. It's not as if it's going to change your life magically overnight. I know when I first started to meditate, I was a little disappointed that something magical didn't happen the first week that I was doing it. But over the years, I have found that meditation is incredibly beneficial. And it's a great way to open up to the vast power and depth that exists within every single human being.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So nicely said. Thank you. That's great. Absolute pleasure. I knew it would be. I've been looking forward to it for